Entry ticket for tomorrow is to look at this photograph and describe what you see. So when and where do you think this picture was taken? Why do you think this? What in the photo makes you think that? What were 3 things you think people living in this setting did in the years following this photograph? So what do you think people were doing after this photograph was taken? So, whether you guessed it or not, that picture is of a town after the Civil War, and what we're talking about here is Reconstruction in a literal sense, and then in a sort of figurative sense, what the country needed to do to reconstruct, to bring everybody back together at the end of the Civil War. When we're talking about the Reconstruction era, there are a few major questions that we have to think about. How do we rebuild the South? How do we bring Southern states back into the United States? And then what do we do with former slaves that are now free people? Do we give each of them $1 million and say, sorry for how we treated you? Or what is the most practical thing that we can do to deal with all of these slaves? And each of these questions are wrapped up in the politics of Reconstruction era. So the Reconstruction era is the period immediately following the Civil War when the country needed to get along again. The outline for this period was established by Lincoln, although people sort of debated and there are a lot of politics surrounding what we should do to reconstruct the nation. Many laws were passed on behalf of blacks during this time. When you think of Reconstruction, you should think of 3 major shifts in U.S. policy. The first shift is the passing of the 13th Amendment, which effectively ended slavery in all of the U.S. states. The 14th Amendment established blacks as people and said that they cannot be stripped of due process, which essentially undid Dred Scott. The 14th Amendment is a little bit more complicated in that it says that any person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen, and this will become important when we're talking about women's rights. But it basically said anybody born here is a citizen, and all citizens cannot be stripped of due process. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, and this is also important when we talk about women's rights because while this is a huge step forward for America in that it gives black men the right to vote and it sees all men as citizens and as eligible to vote, it is the first time the word man is actually in the Constitution, and so it creates a huge hurdle for women moving forward. These amendments are passed years apart, and so there are some interesting things that happen in between the passage of each of these amendments. One of the first things that the U.S. government did is they created a department known as the Freedmen's Bureau, and this was created to ensure the rights and protections of former slaves. Rejoining the Union, like I already said, was a really complicated process and something that senators and leaders at the time did not take lightly. Southern states were gradually admitted back into the Union. Lincoln had issued later on in the war, a proclamation of amnesty, which basically said that states could rejoin if they swore allegiance to the Union. And he did this in hopes that he could stir up pro-Union support in the South. And so people are throwing out all sorts of different ways to A, end the war, and then B, admit these states back into it. And Lincoln's vision with this proclamation of amnesty is essentially if they swear allegiance to us, then we can consider admitting them back in. Republicans, Lincoln's party, the Republicans, were pretty divided on Reconstructions. Some favored more radical approaches, which made it more difficult for Southern states to rejoin the Union, and others wanted things just to go back to an amicable relationship really quickly. So we wanted to make it as easy as possible for the Southern states to rejoin. Just come back and be our sibling, be our brother again. One thing that we did do is we did establish a military government. So ultimately, a military government was set up in the South, which allowed the northern states to occupy territories in the South until those southern states accepted the new Constitution with the new amendments and swore allegiance. So there was sort of a multifaceted process for joining. You can see in the map here that the different districts that were created, Tennessee had sworn allegiance early on, so they were not a part of that. But you can see Virginia was District 1, North Carolina and South Carolina were District 2, District 3 is Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, and then Arkansas and Mississippi are District 4, and then Texas and Louisiana make up District 5. And each of these were governed by one of the former Union generals. So when we say military government, we mean military government in that generals are running the government, and there was a military force occupying that area. Scallywags. This is in quotations on purpose. This is a derogatory term. It stands for northern missionaries that were sent to the South to educate and uplift slaves. They're usually northern white women and men, although there were some southern and actually there was a lot of southern white people that were sort of were Republicans, so Southern Republicans, who were also known as Scallywags. And their goal is, and this is one of the things that we did, and the Freedmen's Bureau did, was to send these people down, or to pay these people as sort of a Reconstruction way of dealing with this new black population who have not been educated. So we can educate these people and give them opportunity to do well in life and maybe improve their status in the country. This is a big deal. Following Reconstruction, former slaves were becoming educated for the first time, and this is one of the big steps forward that happens in the Reconstruction era. So take a look at this photo, and this is going to be important for our activity in class. Describe what you see in this picture. What do you think this is a picture of? Why do you think that? Be specific. And in particular, when you're looking at this picture, do you think this is, when do you think this is? And why do you think that? This is an interesting picture. In terms of, it's hard to tell when this picture is taken. So take a guess as to when you think this picture is taken. The picture that you were just looking at is a picture of African Americans in the Reconstruction era. And the point there is that it looks relatively similar to the slave era. So black codes, laws passed in some of the southern states to limit the freedom of former slaves. Some of these laws included things like they had to carry papers, they could not be out at certain hours, they had to deal with separate facilities like separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate train cars, things like that. So the black codes were things that essentially limited the power and the freedom and undid a lot of the progress that the Freedmen's Bureaus and these so-called scallywags were making in the South, and essentially kept black people as slaves. Radical Republicans tried to nullify these codes by passing amendments that would, or laws that would make these codes illegal, but they failed because of opposition in Congress. Take a look at the political cartoon here from a newspaper during this time. It says, "The Freedmen's Bureau to keep the Negro at the expense of the whites, voted by the president, and make a law by Congress. If you support Congress, you support the Negro. Sustain the president, you protect the Negro." And you can see the racist ways in which they have drawn former slaves there, who are lackadaisically relaxing while the white men are out in the fields working. So you can see that there was a lot of opposition to some of the things that Congress was doing in the South, and definitely did not see black people as even human, but let alone equal to white people. Andrew Johnson was one of the few presidents that was not from the upper class, but he was Abraham Lincoln's vice president during the Civil War, and he's a really controversial figure. He issued a series of proclamations that sped up Southern admission back into the Union, and this was really, really, really unpopular amongst radical Republicans. His actions indirectly united Republicans, and unfortunately it united them against him. So he passes all these proclamations, which he can do, just like Lincoln did, that made it easier for Southern states to join, which made radicals who wanted to hold the South accountable and make it more difficult for them to join and make them swear their allegiance and make them promise, all these different things. He essentially turned his back on his own party. And interestingly, he was a Southern Republican, and he had owned slaves. He was very much, he was new to the Republican Party, and I don't think people should have trusted him as much as they did. Some people call him the third worst president in U.S. history. The Congress passed something called the Tenure of Office Act to keep him from appointing people that they didn't like. And this was a political move trying to undercut him. You'll need to know the Tenure of Congress Act for sure. And this didn't really work because he did, and so they tried to pursue impeaching him based on the fact that he had violated this act that they passed to keep him from basically doing his job and appointing people that they didn't like. And so this was kind of a complicated, we're going to do everything we can to keep you from actually doing things as president by his own party. And so essentially they're trying to impeach him for political sort of not legitimate, you have violated the office reasons. And so it didn't work. They tried to impeach him. It doesn't work. The trials basically ruin Andrew Johnson's prospect of any second election or second term. But the failure of this impeachment sets a precedent to not impeach presidents over political issues. So this is a step forward, I think, for the system, in that it's the first time we try to impeach a president and it doesn't work. And so it sets the precedent that we really can't impeach presidents unless they really, really do something wrong. And so we'll see when we get to later impeachment processes when, the times in the future when we try to impeach presidents. And there's a lot of talk these days about trying to impeach Obama and other people, and there's no validity to that unless Obama actually does something wrong. Tomorrow in class, we're going to look at some of Thomas Nast's cartoons. And so what you need to know about Thomas Nast right now is that he was a German-born, so immigrant to America. He was a caricaturist and an editorial cartoonist, and as a result, he had a lot of influence on American society. He's considered the father of the American cartoon. And tomorrow we're going to look at some of the cartoons he draws during the Reconstruction era. And what's important for you to understand is that he supported black enfranchisement, which means getting the right to vote. But he seemed hesitant about their participation in government. So maybe they're allowed to vote, but maybe not run for office or other things. So we're going to look at some of these cartoons and how they sort of manifest and present his opinion in class tomorrow. We're also going to look at sharecropping. One of the strongest protections in the Constitution is property rights. And the government was unwilling to take property or land from the ex-white Confederates and plantation owners and give it to former slaves, which would have provided slaves with economic security and opportunity because they would have owned land, they would have been able to work that land, which they know how to work because they've been doing it as slaves for decades. So, but unfortunately, the government was unwilling to take away land from the losers of the war. They were unwilling to take away land from white people and give it to black people. And there could be a number of reasons for that, racist or otherwise. And so as a result, this system of sharecropping develops. And what the system is essentially farmers rent land. The sharecroppers are black people, former slaves, that rent land from rich white people, aka their former owners, and they pay them rent in crops, and so they actually don't get any money as a result of this system. And the system is really, it essentially looks a lot like slavery, which you may have guessed from the picture earlier. The system of sharecropping kept power in the hands of the whites, the ones that we fought the war against for a reason, unfortunately.